Today, we're going to be looking at the top 10 counties in Florida with the highest OD rates. The state of Florida averages 35 out of 100,000, and that's a very sad figure. But even worse is that some counties in our state have rates more than twice that. So we found analytics on the internet for every single county in Florida, and we're going to let you know which counties have the biggest problem. We recently did a video about the state of Florida in general, and I had somebody in the comments section say that the reason the rate is so high in Florida is because of the large cities. So I went on the internet and I found statistics for each county, and let me tell you that while most people think that it's the large cities in Florida that are driving up these numbers, the truth is far from that. So if you have a problem with analytical information, this is not my opinion. I didn't make this up. These are the real numbers coming out of Florida. The problem in the state of Florida is in the rural counties. And in fact, large cities like Miami have a rate that's about 1/3 the state average. So while many people on my Florida video made comments like Tampa, Orlando, and Miami are driving up these numbers, the reality is that these large cities actually have a rate that's below the state average. And there's a region around Tallahassee, Florida that is rural African American, and they are also below the state average. But the vast majority of the problem stems from rural and suburban counties where a lot of people are retiring. The people in rural America are blaming the people in the inner cities for causing these problems. However, I have seen in Southwest Florida, where I am from, that it's the rural areas that have this problem. And this trend isn't just in Southwest Florida, it's the entire state. However, despite the fact that the rural communities are the ones that are dealing with these problems, the mindset among people in rural communities is to say stuff like, well, it's the big cities that got all the problems. But the reality is that rural America is in the grips of one of the worst things that has ever happened to the people of this country. And instead of taking accountability for the problem in their rural communities, they want to put the blame on the hardworking people that live in cities. Liberty County, outside of Tallahassee, had the lowest rate. They reported 0 people lost, and they really deserve respect for that. In the other rural counties surrounding Tallahassee, these areas also had below state average, composing mostly of African American rural communities. The rural vicinity of Tallahassee, all those small counties out there, did the best in the entire state. To my surprise, Dixie County was below the state average. So there is a region on the northern end of the Big Bend heading into Tallahassee, that entire region of the state average below the rest of Florida. And that is a great thing for this area. The county of Dade was at about 11 out of 100,000, which is about 1/3 less than the rest of Florida. And it seems like Tampa, Orlando did very well. There's 2 urban areas that did really bad, that being Pinellas County and that being Duval County. And I will explain to you why those 2 urban counties have a bigger problem. Hispanics and African Americans have a lower rate than whites. This problem is mostly prevalent in the white communities. That's why Dade County has a much lower rate. That is also why the African American rural part of Florida also has a much lower rate. Surprisingly, out of all the counties and all the demographics, African Americans in Lafayette County, which is around Mayo, Florida, had the highest rate of any race county combination, coming in at 95 out of 100,000. That is very unfortunate. But let's get on with this list. the #1 county with the biggest problem in the state of Florida, Citrus County, with a rate of 83 out of 100,000. This is an absolute shock. There's no bad neighborhoods in Citrus County. This is a county where people are retiring to, mostly rural and suburban areas that look beautiful and calm and quiet. I have been advocating on my channel that this is a good place to retire affordably, and unfortunately it seems like affordable retirement are the key words that are making this area bad. I don't know what it is about this particular demographic that makes it bad, but it's very clear that in the state of Florida, areas that people are retiring to looking for affordability actually have some of the worst rates in the entire state. It's a very unfortunate situation and a very misleading statistic because you would never think that this would be it. #2 is Escambia County. This is the region of Pensacola, Florida, and while the surrounding state of Alabama has a much lower rate, as soon as you cross the Florida line, there's a huge problem. 70 out of 100,000 means that you're more likely to die from an OD in Pensacola than you are to die from a murder in a border town in Mexico. Again, this is an affordable city compared to the rest of Florida, and it seems that those that want to make the Florida dream come true and find a region of the state where property values are more affordable can end up running into some problems. Unfortunately, the city of Pensacola has a disturbingly high overdose rate, and this city has also had a lot of other problems from natural disasters. Could it be that Alabama's strict laws are pushing people to end up here? #3, Volusia County with a rate of 68 per 100,000. This is practically the Daytona area to the northeast of Orlando. The Daytona area has long been known as a problem city. People from other states come here to party, and a lot of times they end up getting themselves into a lot of trouble. However, many of the other counties on this list that have a below average number also have a lot of tourism. Could it just be that Daytona attracts the wrong crowd? Regardless, the Daytona area is one of the worst problems in the state of Florida. You're more likely to die from an OD in this county than you are to die from a murder in the city of St. Louis or the city of Detroit. Surprisingly, while we all know Detroit is known for that, bet you didn't know Daytona had this problem. Moving on to #4, Hernando County, which is practically Spring Hill and Brooksville, Florida. This is an area north of Tampa that has also been known as a quiet, affordable place to retire. With people from New York moving to this area to retire affordably, it seems like a beautiful rural area. However, when you put away the natural beauty of these rolling hills, a very dark reality comes into play. Not only now in the middle of the crisis we're living after the year 2020, but even long before that, this region of the state has had a huge problem. So don't let these beautiful houses sitting in beautiful rolling hills fool you. This part of Florida has a serious problem. A problem that was visible even before things got bad after 2020. Moving on to #5. Marion County with a rate of 61 per 100,000. This is literally the rural area surrounding Ocala, Florida. This area has long been known for having problems in its rural vicinity, and things are only getting worse. Communities like Fort McCoy are isolated far off in the rural places near the Ocala National Forest. You think people out here would be enjoying the natural scenery and just living a quiet life? Hidden behind these oak trees are some of the saddest realities that people could be living in the state of Florida. In general, Ocala has been known to have a huge problem. In places like Highway 200, southwest of Ocala, you can grasp some of the problem by seeing the amount of people begging and loitering and sleeping in vehicles behind businesses. Moving on to number 6, Brevard County, which is mostly the Melbourne area. The Florida East Coast has a huge problem. Brevard is also right there on the East Coast next to the Daytona area. This area has a huge problem with the white population having a much higher percentage of OD than the black communities. However, it seems like law enforcement is more focused on going into the African American communities while the white community suffers and nothing is done about it. It seems like it's incredibly ignorant how in this part of Florida it's the white communities that have the highest OD rate, but it's the black communities that are being targeted by law enforcement. The rate for blacks in this county is 45, and the rate for white people in this county is 65. Despite the fact there's a problem in the white communities, law enforcement seems more focused on what they can do for the African Americans. Moving on to number 7, Pinellas County with 57 out of 100,000. This county is a suburban white county outside of Tampa, and Pinellas County has a lot of problems, from poverty to high crime, high property crime, as well as one of the highest OD rates in the state of Florida. With places like Clearwater and St. Petersburg within its boundaries, you would think that the people here would have plenty to live for with beautiful beaches and tropical weather. The rate for African Americans here is 51. That means that the black community is also suffering along with the white community. While in Pinellas County this problem is shared, in other parts of the state, the white people are disproportionately being lost at a higher rate. Surprisingly, the rate for Hispanics here is only 30 out of 100,000, proportionately less. Moving on to number 8, Pasco County with 56 out of 100,000. Guessing by the reputation that Pasco County has, you might have thought it would have been number 1. These are poor rural areas where in fact poverty and lifestyles that are almost inhumane are normal. However, despite the county's reputation and the fact that most people consider Pasco County what they call Trashco County, it really has a bad reputation in the state of Florida. It isn't the worst in the state, but it is still a top contender. You'll find in Pasco County many young people who are simply throwing their lives away with these lifestyles. Featured on TV shows like Cop and the end of jokes for many people on social media, it seems that people are more entertained than disgusted with the situation here. Moving on to number 9, Levy County. Levy County is a rural area in the Big Bend region with little towns like Otter Creek and Williston. Some of these towns have really suffered economically. Jobs here don't pay well, and while there is a coastline, there are no beaches. This is really a sad region of Florida. Surprisingly, as you move further along the Florida Big Bend outside of Levy County, the numbers actually go down. Levy County is really along US 19, which is where most of these really bad counties lay. And this area has been infamous for having some of the worst problems in the state of Florida. The small communities are suffering, and the people here seem to have no hope. Despite the fact it's an entirely rural county with no large cities, it has one of the biggest crises in the state of Florida with no real end in sight. Number 10 is Duval County with a rate of 54. Duval County is basically Jacksonville, but the city limits of Jacksonville expand far, covering many small rural towns like Baldwin. The rate for Hispanics here is 24, and for blacks is 40, which means that the vast majority of this problem lies solely with the white community, living not in the urban core of Jacksonville, but in the rural suburbs of the city and many of the small towns that were incorporated into Duval County. And while some of the other counties adjacent to Duval did not make the list, The rate there for whites is some of the highest in the entire state, only being held back by the fact that the black population lowers their averages. So we can say that rural small towns around Jacksonville are really suffering. However, when you cross the line into Alabama or Georgia, these numbers seem to drop dramatically, which means this is uniquely a Florida problem. In the state of Alabama, the highest rates are surrounding the city of Birmingham, which means that the vast majority of southern Alabama has a very low rate, as well as the adjacent state of Georgia. So what makes Florida have a problem almost twice as bad as its two neighboring states? Could it be the state's laws? Could it be the type of people that are attracted to the state of Florida? Could it be that the prisons in Alabama and Georgia are so much worse that people who choose this lifestyle would much rather live in a state where it's a little bit easier when you hit the correctional systems? Could it be that in Florida, law enforcement tends to ignore the white population and target blacks and Hispanics, giving whites the opportunity that take part in these activities to feel like they have free realm? I'm not really sure what the cause of the problem is, but when you look at surrounding states like Georgia and Alabama, Florida's situation is almost twice as bad. As always, I have a strange theory to prove it, but it's nothing more than my personal opinion. We've dealt with nothing but facts and statistics on this video, but I'm going to throw my own twist on things. I feel like a lot of people that retire to Florida looking for affordability, end up buying a house or even paying it off, are going to end up eventually passing away because they're just coming here for 5 to 7 years to live the last years of their life in retirement. And I feel that when these people pass away, they'll have a kid in their 40s who's been waiting for grandma and grandpa to pass, and they're the ones that come over here and get these properties for free in rural areas. Then they go on to have no job, have no real responsibilities like rent and mortgage, and to live in these rural areas in a house that they inherited from someone. And these are usually the problem people. You hear so much on the media on how it's Hispanic and black communities that are ruining everything, how it's the big cities that have a problem. But when you look at these numbers, you start to see where the real problem lies. However, instead of taking responsibility for their situation, they want to go ahead and blame other people who have nothing to do with their problem. Like one of our subscribers mentioned, the biggest cure to not getting an OD is not to get your hands dirty with anything illicit. If you're clean, there's nothing really to worry about. These are the real numbers and the real facts about what's going on in Florida. I want to ask you, the audience, the news outlets that you listen to, the radio stations, YouTube channels, and TV channels that you watch, how have they been portraying this situation? Who have they been putting the blame on? And do you think that they're being honest with you about how they're depicting this problem? Hispanic communities like Miami and El Paso, Texas, which are depicted as some of the worst cities on media today, actually have some of the lowest rates in the entire country. And the state of Texas, which is predominantly rural and Hispanic, has one of the lowest rates in the entire country at about 14 per 100,000. California's rate of 19 per 100,000 is one of the lowest in the country. However, California is depicted as a horrible place in all types of media outlets. However, the places these people are moving to, like West Virginia and South Carolina, have some of the worst rates in the country. Do you think these people are being deceived into moving to these places that are far worse? Do you think families that want the best for their people have no other option but to move to big cities that are more expensive? Because it seems like all these areas that are affordable seem to be very comfortable places for people with no expectations to settle in and get very comfortable. My message to you, if you live in a big city, and look, I'm a person who moved out of Florida and moved to rural Alabama, and then I moved back to Florida cities because I realized that these urban areas are difficult to live. We have to pay extremely high rents, everything expensive, job markets more competitive. But when you move to these areas that are more affordable, they have their own set of problems too. And in your big city like Miami, you're actually going to see less crime than in some of these rural parts. Many people from Miami and Broward County have moved to these rural parts of Florida in hopes that they would encounter less crime. But we believed rhetoric that was misleading. I believed it because I moved out of South Florida thinking that there was less crime in the rural parts of the United States. Come to find out, that wasn't true. So if you're a person living in a big city and you think that by moving to a small town you're going to find less crime, it turns out that this is a false illusion. The best outcome your family could have is for you to work hard in a big city. Let me throw some other pieces of information that I found while doing the research for this video. In Collier County, which is in the Naples, Florida area where I am from, Hispanics are 1/3 less likely to die from an OD than the white population. Lee County, Florida, which is the Fort Myers area, came in at 45 per 100,000. It would have been about number 15 on this list if we had kept going. Sarasota County also had a ridiculously high number. I was really surprised to see Sarasota and Lee County having numbers so high, considering that they're relatively expensive areas where a lot of people are moving to make their lives better. A lot of people would not even consider Miami as an option, but they would move to Southwest Florida thinking that Miami has higher crime rates and higher problems. Definitely not true. Keep in mind, Miami is extraordinarily expensive, so if you're moving there, you're going to have to pay a lot of money to be in that city. And if you're paying a lot of money to live in a place that's expensive, chances are you're not going to end up living like that. But it's absolutely crazy how for so many years, the people that live in these rural counties of North Central Florida come to my Miami videos to say how horrible Miami is. And now when you look at these numbers, you realize that they're the ones that have a problem. And Miami is actually 1/3 of the state's average. So very interesting information. I found it really interesting how in Miami-Dade County, the white population also had a very low rate. So whites in Miami also have a very low rate, just like Hispanics. So I think the problem might stem not so much from Hispanics not being part of the problem as the places where Hispanics live are less prone to it. Take the Hispanic population in Bay County, which is the Panama City Beach area. It's not really a Hispanic area, but the Hispanics in Bay County have a rate of 46 per 100,000, which is alarmingly the highest Hispanic rate in the entire state. And it's not within a Hispanic city like Miami, Tampa, or Orlando. It's within a panhandle county, which makes me think that sometimes when you're a minority, and a white person could in the same sense be a minority. A white person moving to Miami, for example, would be a minority. But like when you are a minority in the place where you live, in the case of Hispanics in the Florida Panhandle, that you're more likely to be a victim of this stuff, which means that sometimes it's the most vulnerable people who are being fed this crap. Like in the case of Hispanics who, instead of living in a large city, decide to live in a rural area. Or could it be that Hispanics who move into an area that's that far from other Hispanic communities are more acclimated to the American culture and are, in a sense, more like the blacks and the whites in their culture, thus they're more likely to end up doing those things versus a Latino in Miami or Tampa or Orlando that's closer to their community and their roots and their values and wouldn't engage in those activities? That is an interesting question. The fact that Lafayette County had just a high rate for African Americans, I found that really concerning because there really aren't too many blacks in that county. But when you go one county over, you start that area around Tallahassee that's rural and African American. But that little community that's right next to it's mostly white, and the blacks there have a higher rate, which makes me think that a lot of times the people that are most likely to end up on this stuff are the minorities in an area. Distasteful thing to have to say, but it seems like all races are more likely to put this stuff in the hands of other races. You really can't believe what you hear in the media. Like, we're being told that this stuff is mostly coming from Mexico, but there's a lot of stuff coming in from Canada too. What's to say that's not where it's coming from? you just can't believe anything anymore. So like whatever you hear on the media, just don't believe it, because when you start to look at these analytics, you'll find out that sometimes, they're blaming somebody else for their problems, and they're demonizing other people with being the root cause of a problem when they're really not. So I'm not even going to repeat what people say that it's coming from Mexico, because now you look at this problem and you're like, well, where is it really coming from? Because if it's mostly in rural America, not in the big cities, it would make sense. I don't know. I just feel like we really have to be careful what we believe and what we repeat based off of what we hear. If it's not coming from like a source where you can say, okay, this is official. Like in the case of St. Louis and Detroit, we know that they have high murder rates, but those two statistics get so much attention. Everybody knows that St. Louis and Detroit have a huge problem with murders, but they're also large African American cities. Take Citrus County, Florida. The OD rate there is higher than the murder rate in both of those African American cities. But I didn't even know that, and I study Florida analytics. So it just goes to show that sometimes the information that we're fed is selective and hand-fed to us, so that we only get to see the picture that they want to show us. But you can't just open a book to one page. You have to read the entire book and see the whole picture. But we're only being fed bits and pieces, and they're the bits and pieces that they want to show us to get the agenda, the message that they want you to see. And this is where we all have to pay attention, because even I myself, when I moved to Alabama, being a rural area, I just imagined, all the problems are in big cities and expensive areas. Find somewhere affordable. Small town people are friendly. And I found out that that wasn't really true. Literally, the entire South Florida is in the light blue, and it's North Florida that's in the dark blue, the areas with a larger problem, with the exception of Monroe County, which is the Florida Keys. And I found that kind of interesting how, well, wouldn't you think that with as expensive as it is to live in the Florida Keys, these aren't even normal areas. These are areas where people come to vacation and to spend the winter, and they have a problem? I have not explored these rural counties around Tallahassee that have a large African American population. I just looked at the analytics and said, well, it's a poor area, so what type of interest would there be in poor rural African American areas? So I never really covered that area very well. Now that I see that their analytics are much lower in these categories, I'm really curious to go out there and spend a good deal of time in this area and kind of feel it out better and understand what's going on in that area better, because it seems like it's an area that I've overlooked because it's really not interesting at all. I'm going to say that Pensacola being so high on this list caught me off guard in so many ways, because you would think that being close to Alabama, it would have a lower rate, but it's actually one of the highest in the states. Now, I don't know if people from Alabama come over here. It could be simply that because it's the first county along I-10 when you hit Florida, that's where stuff lands, and that stuff like people from Mississippi and Alabama and other states that have stricter regulations that want to live in Florida but be closer to their home end up in this county, because I know for a fact that in the state of Alabama, law enforcement, the condition of the prisons in that state are a huge deterrent. So maybe people come to Florida just so they can do that and feel like it's not as much of a problem here. And they're moving to Florida down everybody's throat. And are people overlooking the fact that this problem is so bad in Florida? Because they're moving from states that have a smaller problem to here, and they think that when they move to Florida, they're going to end up like not having that problem. Like, oh, we moved to Florida and now the world's perfect. No, it's not. Like, the world of your problems has only just begun here. And it's crazy how the people that are moving to Florida have this notion in their brains that when they move here, oh, everything's perfect in Florida, they're doing everything right. But who are you believing? Who are you getting this information from? Because some of the counties that are most likely to give you a message that we're safe, we got everything under control, we're doing the best we can, are actually the areas with the biggest problem, namely Polk County, Lee County. They're not low on this list, but when you look at how these counties are promoted to people, they're promoted as safe places where they're doing everything the right way. And then the places you don't hear about, like Miami, that are actually the places people say are horrible, actually have the best situation. Isn't that interesting? Quite the confusion.